You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. As I said at the top, it is a Canadian domiciled show, but we try to get a sense of what's happening in the world everywhere. And certainly with the American election coming up in just a couple of weeks, we'd be remiss to not point it out, but it's not coming from the place of obsession like a lot of Canadian media approaches it, nor is it coming from the place of not actually understanding American politics. I've spent a lot of time focusing on U.S. politics and in the U.S., observing elections and whatnot, and I think it's very important that we talk about this in a more measured way than a lot of other Canadians do. With that being said, I want to talk about some of the big themes in this. We've got the debate coming up on Thursday, as I said, the election coming up in just a couple of weeks, and we've also got some dynamics in the media that I think are going to play out regardless of what happens, but I want to talk about some of those eventualities. Very pleased to be joined on the phone by my friend and a colleague, Dennis Lennox, a conservative and Republican commentator and strategist. Dennis, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Now, one of the things that I think is important to start off on here, you being from Michigan, this was one of the great stories of the 2016 election, where you had the Democrats not pay any attention to Michigan, Wisconsin, the Midwest more generally, and these people really being, I think, the cornerstone of Donald Trump's victory. Where do you see the Midwest playing a role in 2020?
Well, in 2016, by this point, I had actually predicted that Trump would win because of what I was seeing on the ground in Michigan. This time around, though, Andrew, I just can't make a prediction. I want to believe that Trump's enthusiastic support gives him an immeasurable advantage. I mean, let's be honest, nobody really supports Joe Biden. And of course, I know many of the listeners aren't aware of sort of the inter-machinations and dynamics, but basically Biden has no support. You contrast that by Trumpsters, Trumpians, Trumpists, whatever we call them. Many of those people would jump off the Peace Bridge for Trump. I've never seen anything like it. Those people never came out for Romney. They never came out for McCain. Never seen them in the past. I've said for 4 years this election in places like Michigan will be about turnout. If more Republican voters show up, Trump's going to win. It's not that I don't believe the polls. I just don't trust them. I saw some internal private polling that I'm privy to over the weekend and I'm no pollster, but I've been around the game for a while, that, the sample that they had put together for us, 70% of the respondents were cell phone respondents. Great. If you're in York Center, if you're in Detroit, that works great. You're in these rural areas, states like Michigan and Wisconsin that are going to largely be decided by rural voters. I'm not quite sure if a 70% cell phone sample is actually reflective of the voter demographics, let alone a 75-year-old retiree in Florida or a 70-year-old auto worker in Ohio. I just don't see them using YouGov's online polling panel. It's entirely possible that Trump wins, but the math is so stacked against Republicans because of the Electoral College system and the changing demographics of this country. He's got to run the table. He has to win Florida. He has to win Ohio. He has to win Arizona, which is becoming very difficult. He has to carry North Carolina, and he either needs to win Pennsylvania or he needs to win a combination of Michigan and Wisconsin. Otherwise, it's just mathematically impossible for the Republicans to win because of the changing demographics of the United States.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. And I don't want to get too in the weeds on numbers, but it used to be, 4, 5, 6 elections ago that there were a few states that if you won those, you had a fighting shot. Now there is a series of states for a Republican, not for a Democrat, a series of states for a Republican wherein everything needs to go right for you to win.
Not just 4 or 5 elections ago. Look, Trump last week was in Georgia, 2.5 weeks before the election. Trump was in Georgia. That would have been unthinkable an election ago. I mean, that is the American Trump going to Georgia 2.5 weeks before the election 4 or 8 years ago would have been considered the American equivalent of the Tory leader going to Battle River Crowfoot 2 weeks before the election. The reality is Arizona went solidly red. North Carolina went solidly red. Georgia went solidly red. They're all either blue now or trending that way. Virginia is a lost cause. Texas is trending battleground status. There's not a single blue state, blue in the American context being leftist, that is trending Republican. So the Democrats have a demographic advantage to their favor in that most of these red states that are desirable places to live are trending Democrat, and that hurts Republicans. Now, Trump did something in 2016 that no other Republican could do. Let's not forget this. The Republican Party was dead. It was on life support before Trump. This is a party that, once in 6 attempts won a national majority over 24 years. Trump did something that no other Republican could have done. If the nominee in 2016 had been Chris Christie or Little Marco or Lying Ted or, Scott Walker, the idea that any of them could have beaten Hillary Clinton is absurd.
Yeah, and this was, I think, the big story, and where there is an importance in anyone who's outside of the U.S. looking in to understand, which is the dynamics that really drove the Trump victory. And a lot of those people, I guess, here's the question, the people that had lost their factory job to outsourcing to China, people that had been forgotten by Democrats and Republicans for the last half a century in rural America, the people that were called bitter clingers by Obama, the flyover country. I mean, we've heard all the euphemisms, the deplorables. Are those people still Trump supporters 4 years later, or do we even know?
Sure, but there's just not enough proverbial bald, fat old white men with plumber's crack to win the election. I mean, that there's just not enough of them. I said it in 2008. In fact, actually, I think in one of your previous iterations, we've had this discussion before. I said it in 2008 after the Obama tidal wave that the Republican Party had to start looking and talking like the America of the second decade of the 21st century. We're now in the third decade of the 21st century. The reality is you just can't win with bald, fat, old white men. Now, Trump's goal is to gin up the turnout as much as he can, pick off enough of the African American black vote, and do a respectable number with Hispanics in states like Nevada, Florida, and Arizona. That it will, cancel out the losses that the Republicans are facing in once solidly red states and in suburbs which were trending Democrat before Trump. I mean, Trump is, the conclusion of a realignment. He gets blamed for Republican problems in the suburbs, in places like Detroit and in Pennsylvania, etc. The reality is any honest political observer will admit that those areas were trending Democrat long before Trump. We're at the end of an American political realignment where, the Democratic Party, despite its rhetoric, is basically a gentry liberal party, the equivalent of York Center or whatever in Canada, and the Republican Party now is a rural party with working class voters and small business owners.
So let me ask you then about these cultural dynamics, because this is not going to go away. I mean, I know everyone says that politics gets more and more polarized, but we're at the point where people are talking, whether it's an exaggeration or not, about being on the brink of a civil war of sorts. And I don't want to get too into this idea of conspiratorial theorization, but I do think it's going to be messy whatever happens, and especially if Trump wins re-election. I mean, we've already seen in the last couple of months riots and looting. I suspect there will be some version of that.
Let's be honest,
what
though,
happens?
Right? I mean, before we get to the answer of what happens to Trump, let's be honest. Who created the mess? I mean, the reason why we have this strife in our country, anyways, at the moment, and these divisions that we're seeing, is because of the culture wars that the left has, engineered over the past 25 years.
No argument for me on that.
And the reality is, Americans no longer share the same values. Americans no longer, conservative and liberal Americans, or as I like to say, conservatives and progressives, no longer go to the same churches. They no longer shop at the same stores. The integration of American fabric has disintegrated, that sort of post-World War II fabric that bound the country together. We no longer share in the same ideals and same values because the political left is trying to fundamentally change the values proposition of the United States. And I don't think that's a conspiracy theory. But what happens after Trump? Look, whether Trump wins or loses, and I still believe there's a path for him to win, but as I said a few minutes ago, it's mathematically difficult because he basically has to run the table. He can't afford to lose anywhere, whereas Joe Biden can afford to lose a lot of states. But there's going to be a civil war, no pun intended, within the Republican Party, literally, not figuratively, after Trump, regardless of whether he wins or loses. The real question is, what is the Republican Party? I don't see how the Republican Party can return to what it was before Trump. I think that party is dead. I don't see never-Trumpers, the deranged never-Trumpers, particularly the ringleaders, coming back. I don't know how they weasel their way back after what they've done. I think we're at the conclusion of a political realignment. The real question is, how do you keep the Trump voters, enough of them, while still bringing in people that you need? That is to say, Asians, Indians, Hispanics to the column. Trump is doing some interesting things despite the media's reportage, and they're never going to give him credit, with Hispanic voters in states like Florida and Nevada and Arizona, where his numbers are actually pretty respectable. Of course, Trump did better with black voters in 2016 than most Republican nominees, better than Mitt Romney, for example. Never hear of that.
And with women as well,
sure,
another demographic that people wouldn't have expected him to get.
Now, the black vote is a challenge. Personally, there's probably no politically correct way to say this. I've always thought Republicans spending money on the black vote was a wasted effort. I would much rather spend that money on Asians and Hispanics and Indians as in India. Of course, in the United States context, unlike there in Canada, when we say Indians, we mean Native Americans. I think that's where we have to expand. And, the Conservative Party in Canada, Jason Kenney and those sorts of people did some interesting things a few years ago with expanding to those communities, and we can do a better job in the Republican Party with that. Regardless of whether Trump wins or loses. But yeah, Andrew, 2024, the race has already started for 2024. Nikki Haley is out there. She's totally running. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, he's totally running.
Mike Pence thinks he's the heir apparent as well.
Well, I don't think he runs if Trump loses. If Trump wins, Pence totally runs.
No, he goes down with that ship. But that actually brings up another important question of, in that sort of never Trump divide, there are very few neutrals. I mean, there are people that have, become on one hand Trump loyalists and on the other hand were never Trumpers. And you've got a couple of people that were very critical that have kind of more aligned with Trump, like your Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz types. But yeah, well, Nikki Haley's a great example there. But in a lot of cases, I mean, if there is what's perceived as a Trump implosion, it will be very difficult for people who were aligned with Trump to rebound. But I don't think that the never Trump fantasy is going to happen, whereas, the House of Cards comes crashing down and everyone looks to Bill Kristol and David Frum as, being the spiritual leaders who will write all along.
Can we deport David Frum back to Canada, please? Can you guys just take him?
We don't want him. You're stuck with him, Dennis.
Him and Rosie Barton can just hang out all day long because we're sick of her and we're sick of him. She thinks she's on like Fox or CNN by her tweets, about American politics. But no, you're totally right. There is no constituency. There's no demographic for never Trumpism, and there wasn't before. Right? Before Trump, there wasn't. The
demographic is liberal cable news.
Yeah, the reality is that the never Trump brand of republicanism lost 5 out of 6 elections in which it was the dominant ideology of the Republican Party. The real question is going to be, how does somebody, keep Trump voters in the Republican column? I do think the question is going to be, particularly if Trump loses, were you with Trump or did you actively work against him? That is something that Republican primary voters and caucus goers in 2024 will remember, particularly since Joe Biden's only going to be a one-term president. So 2024 is going to either be an open seat or, if you're a conspiracy theorist, Kamala Harris is going to be the sitting president at the time. I would keep an eye on somebody like Kristi Noem. Nobody knows who she is yet, the governor of South Dakota. She's running 2 ads an hour on Fox News using South Dakota tourism money, promoting herself. She's campaigning in states like New Hampshire right now for Trump. Of course, New Hampshire, traditionally holds the first contest in the presidential nominating campaigns. Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, is interesting. Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, is interesting. There are probably a half dozen potential, A-listers out there and high B-listers. Again, though, the problem is it's not so much who the generic Republican nominee after Trump is, it's whether or not the Republican Party can compete demographically when you have states like Texas and Georgia and Arizona either blue or trending competitive. And that's the real challenge, right? You can't win. You can it's already a challenge enough this year when states like Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina, are competitive. If the Republican can't count on Texas, then the Republican Party might as well file bankruptcy and go out of business because there's no way whatsoever it can win.
Yeah, and we've actually talked about that very dynamic on the show in the past with former RNC Chairman Michael Steele about whether the system itself is holding Republicans back rather than helping Republicans, which is what a lot of them still cling to in spite of the math you've just mentioned. So we'll have to have another discussion about that. Dennis Lennox, political commentator and strategist, a conservative, joins me. It's great to talk to you, Dennis. Thanks very much for coming on.
Hey, and thanks for everything you do, Andrew, pushing back at that horrible Canadian media complex that you guys have up there.
Well, I appreciate that, and thanks for being an American that knows what York Center is.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.